Hat sich natürlich aktiv betätigt und war sicherlich als Cousin.
At 92 years old, Johann Schmidt Jr. sits in a modest apartment in Vienna, watching the afternoon light filter through lace curtains. His hands tremble slightly as he holds a cup of coffee, not from age alone, but from the weight of a decision he has carried for 7 decades. Outside, the world moves forward, oblivious to the testimony locked inside this elderly man. But time has become his enemy and his motivation. Before the darkness comes, before his voice joins the countless others silenced by history, he has chosen to speak. He was not supposed to survive. He was not supposed to remember. And he was certainly never supposed to tell anyone what he knew about Adolf Hitler before the world knew his name. Yet here he is, breaking a silence so profound that even his closest relatives never fully understood why he kept it. Johann's story begins not with Adolf Hitler as the world knows him, but as a relative knows him, a presence at family dinners, a boy who watched too much and said too little, a teenager whose eyes seemed to contain something dark that no one dared acknowledge. Johann's father and Adolf Hitler were cousins, their mother's sisters. This connection, this shared blood, became the defining feature of Johann's entire existence. When he was born in 1905, Hitler was already drifting through Vienna, already collecting grievances like others collect coins. The Hitler family was not wealthy, not prominent, not destined for anything extraordinary. They were Waldviertel people, farmers and common laborers from the Austrian countryside, connected by marriage and circumstance rather than any grand purpose. No one in the family could have predicted that one of their own would reshape the entire continent and drag everyone connected to him through the fires of history. Johann remembers the last time he saw Adolf Hitler in person. It was 1907, and Hitler was a teenager visiting the family. The memory has remained crystalline in his mind for 85 years, preserved in detail, like an insect trapped in amber. Johann's father described what he witnessed that day in the garden, a story he told his young son with a kind of horrified fascination that never quite left his voice. Adolf had picked up a frog, and without any apparent emotion, he had begun explaining how the nervous system worked. Then, with methodical precision, he cut it open, not in anger, not in the reckless curiosity of a cruel child, but with a calmness that suggested he was simply conducting an experiment, demonstrating knowledge to those around him. What disturbed Johann's father most was not the act itself, but the utter indifference that accompanied it, as though he were showing a party trick rather than destroying a living creature. Years later, when Adolf Hitler stood before millions in enormous rallies, his father would remember that moment in the garden, that cold casualness, and he would understand that something fundamental had been broken inside his cousin long before the world ever knew his name. Johann's childhood was marked by the shadow of his famous relative, though fame had not yet arrived. His family was ordinary in every way. They farmed, they worked, they went to church, they attended family gatherings where Hitler would appear like an uncomfortable guest who had been invited out of obligation rather than affection. Hitler rarely engaged with the children. He did not play. He did not laugh. He observed. Johann watched him watch others, and even as a boy, he sensed that something was profoundly wrong with the way his cousin looked at the world. The eyes were empty, but not with the emptiness of a gentle person. They were empty the way a mirror is empty, reflecting back what was in front of him, but containing nothing themselves. When the world erupted into war and Hitler emerged as a leader, Johann was not surprised. He had seen the capability for coldness already. What surprised him was everyone else's surprise. The arrest came without warning, as all such things do. Johann was 18 years old when Soviet agents appeared at the door. The war had ended only weeks before, and the world was still sorting itself into victors and vanquished. The Soviets were looking for anyone connected to Hitler, anyone who might have information, anyone who could be held accountable for the crimes that had been committed. In their minds, anyone who shared Hitler's blood was potentially guilty. Johann's father, Johann Sr., was arrested alongside him. His mother, Maria, was taken as well. 2 cousins, Eduard and Ignaz, were pulled from their homes. The crime they were accused of was simple: being related to Adolf Hitler. No evidence was required. No trial was conducted. They were simply loaded onto trucks and transported east, toward the Soviet Union, toward the camps that would define the remainder of their lives. The camps were something beyond what human language was designed to describe. Johann endured years of brutality that stripped away everything but the most basic biological need to survive. Food was measured in ratios that ensured slow starvation. The cold was a constant presence, a fifth dimension that turned water to ice and froze the breath in your lungs. Work was endless and pointless, the kind of labor designed to break a person's spirit rather than accomplish anything productive. Men died around him, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly over weeks and months as disease and malnutrition took their inevitable toll. His father died in 1949. His mother followed in 1953. His cousin, Eduard, died in the camp without ever being released. Another cousin, Maria, was tortured during interrogation until she confessed to crimes she had never committed, and she died in captivity in 1953. Ignaz died of tuberculosis in 1949, his final letter containing nothing but a request for adequate clothing to keep warm. By the time Johann was released in 1955, after a decade of imprisonment, he had lost everything. His family was scattered across graveyards in foreign lands. His home no longer existed. His name was a liability that marked him wherever he went. He returned to Austria as a ghost, a survivor of a nightmare that seemed to belong to someone else's life. The townspeople recognized him but avoided him, sensing perhaps that he carried something too heavy to touch. Johann found work, built a quiet life, married, and maintained the appearance of normalcy. But inside, something had been fundamentally altered. He had learned that speaking was dangerous. He had learned that truth could get you killed. He had learned that silence could keep you alive. These lessons were not abstract philosophical principles. They were encoded into his nervous system through years of trauma and loss. The question that haunted Johann for all those years was simple but impossible to answer. What did the Hitler family know about what was happening? Johann himself had been separated from Hitler for decades before the rise to power, living in the countryside while his cousin was becoming a political figure in Munich and Berlin. But the family still maintained some connections, still sent information back and forth through letters and occasional visits. Did they know about the camps? Did they know about the systematic murder of millions? Johann stayed silent partly because he genuinely did not have clear answers to these questions. But he also stayed silent because speaking would have meant reopening wounds that had barely begun to scar. It would have meant questioning himself about his own role, his own knowledge, his own complicity in a system he had been powerless to stop. The Hitler family itself seemed to understand the same principle. After the war, they scattered and deliberately erased themselves from history. Paula Hitler, Adolf's only full sibling, lived out her remaining years under an assumed name, working in obscurity and refusing all interviews. She died in 1960 with no children, no legacy, no desire to be remembered. William Patrick Hitler, Adolf's half-nephew, changed his name to William Stewart Houston and built a new life on Long Island, opening a medical laboratory and pretending his past did not exist. His sons made a deliberate choice not to have children, effectively deciding to let the bloodline end with them. Angela Hitler, Adolf's half-sister, who had managed his household for years, vanished from public view after the war and never spoke publicly about her brother again. It was as though the entire family made an unspoken agreement to disappear, to fade out of sight, to deny the connection that bound them together. What Johann realized, sitting alone in his apartment in Vienna as he grew older, was that survival had come at a price that extended far beyond the physical. He had survived the camps, yes, but he had not survived intact. None of them had. The trauma had hollowed them out, replaced normal human connection with a kind of permanent guardedness. Johann never fully spoke about what had happened to him. Even to his own family, even to people who loved him, he maintained a careful distance, a protective barrier of silence that they could sense but could not penetrate. He had learned that words could be weapons, that truth could be turned against you, that the safest thing to do was to keep your testimony locked inside where it could hurt no one, least of all yourself. But now, In his final years, Johann has made a different calculation. He realizes that death is coming, that the grave will be just as silent as the camps were loud, and that if he does not speak now, his knowledge will die with him. He is not motivated by anger or a need for revenge. He is not interested in clearing his name or accusing anyone. He is simply tired of carrying the weight alone. He wants the world to understand what it means to be born into a family that committed crimes so enormous that the very mention of the name causes people to recoil. He wants people to know that Hitler had a mother who loved him, that he had cousins who were ordinary, that he was not born a monster, but became one through 1,000 small choices and a world that enabled his ascent. Johann's decision to speak is not dramatic. It is quiet, almost resigned, the way a person might finally admit a secret they have kept their whole life. He does not expect it to change anything. The world has already rendered its judgment on Adolf Hitler. The records are already written. The history books are already closed. But Johann understands something that perhaps only someone who lived through what he lived through can understand, that history is not just what happened, but the testimony of those who witnessed it. His voice, added to the chorus of survivors and witnesses, becomes one more thread in the tapestry of human memory. One more testimony that says, I was here. I saw this. I remember. As Johann sits in his Vienna apartment and finally allows himself to speak, 70 years of silence begins to break. The words come slowly at first, then with increasing momentum, as though a dam has burst and everything locked behind it comes pouring out. He is not trying to rehabilitate Hitler's memory or excuse his crimes. He is simply offering context, the small human details that history often overlooks. He is saying that understanding a monster does not mean excusing monstrosity, but it does mean grappling with the uncomfortable truth that evil does not come from creatures that exist outside humanity. It comes from within us, grows in the soil of our choices, and spreads through the silence of those who should have spoken but did not. Johann Schmidt Jr., Hitler's cousin, finally breaks that silence. Before he dies, he needs the world to know the truth, not the dramatic truth of history books, but the quieter, more unsettling truth of what it means to share blood with darkness and to survive the aftermath. Like, subscribe, and follow for more.